The cabin that Mikael Sorensen built in the Yukon territory in 1906 had no front wall. Where every other structure in the region had 4 walls and a door, Mikael's cabin had 3 walls and a 15-foot wide opening facing south. The entire front of the building was open to the elements. No door, no windows, just an enormous gap that let the wind blow straight through. When other prospectors and trappers saw what he was building, they didn't just question it, they openly ridiculed it. "That's not a cabin," said Thomas Mackenzie, a Scottish trapper who'd been in the Yukon since the gold rush. "That's a shed with delusions. You'll freeze to death in that thing come winter." Mikael continued stacking logs for the back and side walls, not bothering to look up. "I'll be warmer than you." "Warmer? You don't even have a front wall. The cold will pour straight in. The wind will go right through. You might as well sleep outside and save yourself the lumber." "The wind won't go through," Mikael said calmly. "The heat will stay in, and I'll use half the firewood you will." Thomas laughed, a harsh sound in the cold autumn air. "You've lost your mind. 6 months up here alone and you've gone mad." "That's what happens. A man starts building a cabin with no front wall because he's forgotten what winter means." But Mikael hadn't forgotten what winter meant. He'd grown up in northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, where winter darkness lasted 2 months and temperatures regularly dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. He'd spent 5 years working in the logging camps of northern Sweden, sleeping in open-front shelters that stayed warm through the worst weather imaginable. And he'd learned from Sami reindeer herders who'd been surviving in the Arctic for thousands of years, using shelter designs that seemed insane to outsiders, but worked perfectly when you understood the principles. The open-front cabin Mikael was building was called a kami in Sami, or a goati in some dialects. It was based on a design that had kept Arctic peoples alive and comfortable for millennia. The concept was simple but counterintuitive. Instead of trying to seal in heat with 4 walls and a door, you used 3 walls and a massive heat reflector. Instead of fighting the cold with barriers, you worked with fire and physics to create a thermal environment that was actually more efficient than a closed cabin. But to anyone unfamiliar with the design, it looked like suicide. The Yukon territory in 1906 was filling with prospectors and adventurers drawn by tales of gold. Most of them came from temperate climates. They had no experience with true Arctic conditions. They built conventional cabins with 4 walls, small doors, tiny windows, and stoves or fireplaces. These structures worked adequately in moderate cold. They failed catastrophically in extreme cold. Mikael had watched it happen. During his first winter in the Yukon, 1904 to 1905, he'd seen men freeze in their own cabins with 4 walls and doors. The problem was that conventional cabins were designed to trap heat, but they couldn't trap enough heat when the temperature outside dropped to -50 degrees. The doors leaked cold air. The walls conducted heat away. The stoves couldn't keep up with the heat loss. Men would burn wood constantly and still shiver. Mikael had spent that first winter in a cabin he'd bought from a prospector heading south. It was a standard construction: 4 walls, 1 door, 2 small windows, a cast-iron stove. He'd burned through 8 cords of wood that winter and still been cold most of the time. The cabin temperature rarely rose above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even with the stove glowing red hot. At night, when he let the fire die down to conserve wood, the temperature would drop to near freezing within hours. He'd wake up with frost on the inside of the walls. His water bucket would freeze solid 3 feet from the stove. It was miserable. He survived, but he spent the entire winter uncomfortable and exhausted from the constant wood cutting and hauling required to feed the stove. By spring 1905, Mikael had made his decision. He would build a proper shelter. A kami, like the ones he'd slept in during his logging days in Sweden. A shelter that worked with fire and heat reflection instead of fighting against cold with inadequate barriers. He spent the summer of 1905 gathering materials and planning. He needed the right location, a site sheltered from the north and west winds, slightly elevated to avoid cold air pooling. close to timber and water. He found the spot in a small valley 15 miles from Dawson City, protected by hills on 3 sides, a creek running nearby, dense spruce forest providing unlimited building materials. Perfect. The construction began in August 1905. The back wall went up first. Mikael built it thick, very thick. He used logs that were 16 inches in diameter, much larger than standard cabin logs. He stacked them 12 feet high, creating a massive wall that weighed several tons. But he didn't stop there. Behind the first layer of logs, he built a second wall, and in the gap between the 2 walls, he packed clay and moss and stones. The back wall, when finished, was over 3 feet thick, solid, heavy, an enormous mass of wood and earth and stone. The side walls received similar treatment, though not quite as thick. 2 feet of logs, clay, moss, and stone. They angled forward slightly, creating a trapezoidal footprint. The back wall was 16 feet wide. The open front was 15 feet wide. The side walls were 20 feet long, connecting the back wall to the front opening. The roof was equally substantial. Heavy logs covered with a thick layer of sod, then another layer of logs, then more sod. The total roof thickness was nearly 2 feet. The weight was enormous. Mikael had to use large support, posts inside the structure to bear the load. But the result was a roof with tremendous thermal mass and insulation value. The floor was raised 3 feet off the ground on stone piers, creating a crawl space that would be filled with insulating materials before winter. The floor itself was made from split logs laid flat side up over heavy beams, thick, solid, more thermal mass, but the defining feature was the front, 15 feet wide, 12 feet tall, completely open, no wall, no door, just an enormous gap facing south, and this is where Mikael built the reflector wall. 10 feet in front of the cabin opening, he constructed a curved wall of stones. Not a straight wall, but a curve. The wall was 8 feet tall and followed a gentle arc, like a parenthesis shape. The curve was critical. It would reflect heat from the fire back into the cabin while also deflecting wind. The stones for this wall were carefully selected. Flat river stones on the outer face, rough stones filling the interior. The wall was 4 feet thick at the base, tapering to 2 feet thick at the top. The total weight was several tons. When it was finished, the reflector wall curved protectively in front of the cabin opening, creating a partial enclosure. Not closed, but sheltered. The wind couldn't blow straight into the cabin anymore. It hit the curved reflector wall and deflected around. Between the cabin opening and the reflector wall, Mikael built his fire pit. Not a small fireplace. A pit, 6 feet wide, 3 feet deep, lined with stones. This was where the fire would burn. Not inside the cabin, but outside, in the protected space between the cabin opening and the reflector wall. The entire design was based on heat reflection and thermal mass storage. The fire would burn in the pit. The flames and heat would rise, hitting the curved reflector wall. The wall would absorb some heat and reflect most of it back toward the cabin opening. The massive back and side walls of the cabin, 3 feet and 2 feet thick respectively, would absorb the reflected heat. The thick roof would trap rising heat. The raised floor would prevent ground cold from penetrating, and the entire structure, with its tons of thermal mass in the walls, roof, and floor, would store heat and release it slowly. It was a heat battery, a thermal storage system, a design that used physics instead of fighting against it, but to anyone who didn't understand the principles, it looked completely insane. Thomas Mackenzie wasn't the only skeptic. Nearly everyone who saw Mikael's construction had the same reaction. "You forgot to build the front wall," they'd say, half joking. "That's not a cabin, that's a lean-to. You'll need to close that up before winter or you'll die." Mikael explained the design to anyone who asked, though few believed him. The fire heats the reflector wall. The wall reflects heat into the cabin. The back wall, the side walls, the roof, they all absorb heat. They store it, they release it. Slowly. The cabin stays warm even when the fire dies down. But the front is open, cold air will come in. No, the reflector wall deflects the wind, and cold air sinks. The fire keeps the air near the opening warm. The warm air rises and circulates through the cabin. The cold air stays low and flows out around the sides of the reflector wall. What about when the fire goes out? The thermal mass keeps releasing heat for many hours, and the fire doesn't go out. I keep it burning low through the night. You'll burn an impossible amount of wood keeping a fire going constantly. No, small fire, not hot blaze, just steady burning, and the reflector captures all the heat. Nothing wasted up a chimney, much more efficient than a stove. The explanations rarely convinced anyone. The design was too different from what people knew. It challenged too many assumptions. A cabin needed 4 walls. Fire belonged inside, not outside. Heat had to be trapped, not reflected. These were things everyone knew. Mikael's design violated all of them, so people assumed it wouldn't work. Some thought he'd freeze. Others thought he'd realize his mistake and frantically build a front wall when the first cold snap hit. A few thought he was conducting some kind of experiment and had a backup cabin somewhere else. No one thought the open front design would actually function as a primary shelter through a Yukon winter. Mikail finished construction in late October 1905. He moved in his supplies, his food stores, his equipment, his bedding. He prepared for winter. The first test came in early November when the temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Mikail built a fire in the pit, not a huge fire, a moderate fire using dry spruce wood. He let it burn for several hours, adding wood periodically. The flames rose 3 to 4 feet high. The heat radiated outward in all directions, but most of it hit the curved reflector wall. The wall absorbed some of the heat, warming up gradually, and it reflected the rest back toward the cabin opening. Mikail could feel the warmth washing over him as he stood in the cabin opening. It was like standing in front of a giant heater. The heat was intense near the opening, but it didn't just stay there. The warm air rose into the cabin interior, circulating through the space. The massive back wall absorbed the heat. The side walls absorbed the heat. The thick roof trapped the rising warm air. The cabin temperature rose steadily, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 65 degrees, 70 degrees. By evening, with the outside temperature at -15 degrees, the cabin interior was at a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Mikail let the fire burn down to coals overnight, adding just enough wood to keep it smoldering. The cabin temperature dropped slowly. By morning, it was still 60 degrees inside. He rebuilt the fire. Within an hour, the cabin was back to 70 degrees. The efficiency was remarkable. Mikail estimated he was using about 1/4 of the wood he'd burned in his conventional cabin the previous winter, and the comfort level was far higher. The radiant heat from the reflector wall and the thermal mass of the cabin walls created even, gentle warmth. There were no cold spots, no drafts, just steady warmth throughout the space, but this was just -15 degrees, a cold night, but not extreme. The real test would come when the deep cold arrived. Thomas Mackenzie stopped by in late November. He'd heard that Mikail was actually living in the open front cabin. He had to see it for himself. The temperature that day was -25 degrees Fahrenheit. A bitter, clear day with no wind. Thomas approached Mikail's camp expecting to find disaster. Instead, he found Mikail sitting in the cabin opening, wearing just a wool shirt, working on repairing a trap. No coat, no hat, comfortable. "How are you not frozen?" Thomas asked, genuinely confused. Mikail gestured to the fire pit. A small fire burned steadily. The fire, the reflector, the thermal mass. "Come inside, feel it." Thomas stepped through the opening into the cabin. The warmth hit him immediately. It was easily 65 to 70 degrees inside, warmer than his own cabin with a stove burning full blast. "I don't understand. The front is open. How is it this warm?" Mikail walked him through the design, showed him the reflector wall, explained how it captured and directed heat, showed him the massive back and side walls, explained thermal mass storage, showed him the thick roof, explained heat trapping. Thomas listened, his skepticism slowly giving way to grudging acceptance. It works. I don't understand how, but it works. It works because it's designed properly. 4 walls and a stove? That's fighting against cold. This is using fire and heat properly, working with physics, not against it. Thomas left, shaking his head in amazement. He told others what he'd seen. Some believed him, others thought he was exaggerating, or that Mikail had gotten lucky with a warm spell. The skeptics remained skeptical. Then came December 1905. The temperature dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for weeks. This was serious cold, lethal cold, cold that tested every shelter and every heating system. Mikail's open front cabin continued performing perfectly. He maintained his fire, 2 to 3 hours of active burning in the morning, 2 to 3 hours in the evening, just glowing coals overnight. The cabin temperature stayed between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the outside temperature. His wood consumption remained low, 1 cord of wood per month. His neighbors in conventional cabins were burning 3 to 5 cords per month and still struggling to stay warm. The difference was stark, but the ultimate test was still coming. In January 1906, an Arctic air mass settled over the Yukon territory. It brought cold that redefined what cold meant. On January 18th, the temperature at Dawson City was recorded at -62 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the coldest temperature ever recorded in the Yukon up to that time. Exposed skin would freeze in under a minute. Breath would freeze in the air and fall as ice crystals. Metal would become brittle and shatter. Conventional life became impossible. People huddled in their cabins, burning wood desperately, trying to survive. Many cabins couldn't maintain livable temperatures. Even with stoves glowing red hot, the interior temperatures would drop to near freezing. People wore all their clothes indoors. They slept under piles of blankets and furs. They burned furniture when firewood ran low. It was a crisis. On January 21st, 1906, a trapper named Robert Hayes struggled to Mikail's cabin through the killing cold. Hayes had been checking his trap lines when the extreme cold hit. His own cabin was 12 miles away. He couldn't make it back. Mikail's cabin was closer. It was his only chance. Hayes barely made it. He was nearly frozen when he staggered into the clearing where Mikail's camp stood. He saw the open front of the cabin and nearly despaired. An open cabin in -60-degree cold? He was as good as dead. But he had no choice. He stumbled forward. As he got closer, he felt something impossible. Warmth. Actual warmth radiating from the cabin opening. He reached the edge of the reflector wall and collapsed. Mikail pulled him inside. The cabin was warm, not just barely livable, actually warm, comfortable. The interior temperature was around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In -60-degree outside temperature, Mikail's open front cabin was maintaining an interior temperature 70 degrees warmer. Hayes couldn't speak. He couldn't process what he was experiencing. His mind couldn't reconcile the open front with the warmth. It violated everything he thought he knew. Mikail got Hayes out of his frozen clothes, wrapped him in blankets, gave him hot tea, and slowly brought him back to life. Hayes stayed for 3 days while the extreme cold persisted. He watched Mikail manage the fire. Small amounts of wood, steady burning. The reflector wall glowing with stored heat, the massive cabin walls radiating warmth, the system working flawlessly in conditions that were killing people in conventional shelters. The outside temperature is -60, Hayes said on the second day. The inside temperature is, 70 degrees? About that, Mikail confirmed. So there's a 130-degree temperature difference between outside and inside? Yes. And the entire front of your cabin is open? Yes. How is this possible? Mikail explained again. The principles, the physics, the thermal mass, the heat reflection, the difference between trapping heat behind inadequate barriers and managing heat with proper design. Hayes listened. He'd stopped being skeptical. He'd spent 2 nights in comfort while the worst cold in Yukon history raged outside. The evidence was undeniable. When the temperature finally moderated to -30 degrees, Hayes made his way back to his own cabin. He told everyone he met about what he'd seen. A cabin with an open front that stayed 70 degrees warm when the outside temperature was -60. Some people thought he'd gone delirious from the cold. Others thought he was exaggerating, but Hayes was adamant. "I was there. I saw it. I felt it. Sorensen's open front cabin is warmer than any closed cabin I've ever been in, and he's using a fraction of the firewood." The story spread through Dawson City and the surrounding camps. That Norwegian fellow with the crazy cabin, the one with no front wall. Apparently, it stays warm, really warm, even in -60-degree cold. People started visiting Mikael's camp to see for themselves. They'd arrive skeptical. They'd leave converted. The warmth was undeniable. The comfort was obvious, and the efficiency was remarkable. By March 1906, Mikael had requests from 7 different prospectors and trappers who wanted to know how to build similar shelters. He spent the spring and summer of 1906 teaching the design principles and helping others build their own open-front cabins. The technique spread, not widely, because it required more labor and planning than a conventional cabin. But those who took the time to build properly were rewarded with superior performance. The winter of 1906 to 1907 brought another severe cold spell. In late January, the temperature dropped to -53 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there for 5 days. During this period, Mikael's cabin maintained an interior temperature of exactly 6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a temperature differential of 94 degrees, 41 degrees warmer than the minimum 70 degrees Mikael typically maintained. The 6-degree reading was taken when Mikael let his fire burn very low to demonstrate the thermal mass storage capacity. With normal fire maintenance, the cabin stayed at 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit even during the -53-degree cold. That's 123 to 128 degree differential. An open front cabin, no front wall, and it was 120 degrees warmer inside than outside. If this story is showing you that sometimes the most counterintuitive solutions are the most effective, and you want to see more forgotten innovations that challenge what we think we know, hit that subscribe button now. We're diving deep into survival wisdom that seems impossible until you see the science behind it. Subscribe and join us as we uncover more of these incredible techniques. Now let's look at the science behind why Mikael's design worked so well. The physics of Mikael's open front cabin design can be explained through several principles. First, heat reflection. When fire burns, it radiates heat in all directions. In a conventional stove or fireplace, much of that radiated heat goes up the chimney. It's lost. In Mikael's design, the curved reflector wall was positioned to intercept most of the radiated heat from the fire. The curve was important. A flat wall would reflect heat, but in a less focused way. The curve acted like a parabolic reflector, concentrating the reflected heat toward the cabin opening. The stones of the reflector wall absorbed some heat and reflected the rest. As the stones warmed up, they became secondary heat sources, radiating absorbed heat even after the fire burned down. The total reflective and radiative capacity of the reflector wall was enormous. Second, thermal mass storage. Thermal mass is the ability of a material to absorb and store heat energy. Stone, earth, and wood all have significant thermal mass. The more mass you have, the more heat you can store. Mikael's cabin had massive thermal mass. The back wall, 3 feet thick, probably weighed 10 tons. The side walls, 2 feet thick, perhaps 12 tons combined. The roof, nearly 2 feet thick with sod and logs, another 8 tons. The floor, raised but thick, maybe 3 tons. Total thermal mass, 30-plus tons of material capable of absorbing and storing heat. When the fire burned, radiant heat from the fire and reflected heat from the reflector wall warmed these masses. The heat didn't just warm the surface. It penetrated into the material, heating the mass throughout. Once heated, the mass released that heat slowly through radiation. The release rate depended on the temperature differential between the mass and the surrounding air. As long as the mass was warmer than the air, it radiated heat. This created a buffer. During active burning, the mass absorbed excess heat. Between firings, the mass released stored heat. The result was stable temperature despite intermittent heating. Third, convection management. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. This is natural convection. Mikael's design used this principle deliberately. The fire at the cabin opening created a column of rising hot air. This hot air flowed into the cabin, rising toward the thick roof. The roof trapped the hot air, preventing it from escaping upward. The hot air then circulated through the cabin interior, warming the space. As the air cooled by transferring heat to the walls and contents, it sank. But it didn't sink straight down and flow out the opening. The reflector wall and the fire pit created a barrier. Cold air that sank was blocked by the thermal barrier of the fire and reflector wall. It had to flow around the sides of the reflector wall to escape. This created a circulation pattern. Hot air in through the top of the opening. Cold air out around the sides. The open front wasn't a weakness. It was part of the circulation system. Fourth, radiant versus convective heating. Most conventional heating systems rely primarily on convection. They heat air, and the air circulates to warm the space. Convection is inefficient because air has low heat capacity. You have to heat a lot of air to warm a space, and heated air easily escapes through any gaps or openings. Radiant heating is more efficient. Radiant heat warms objects directly without primarily heating the air. The objects then warm the air around them. The reflector wall radiated heat toward the cabin interior. The cabin walls absorbed that heat and radiated it inward. The result was that objects and surfaces in the cabin were warm. The air temperature was secondary. This is why radiant heating feels more comfortable than convective heating at the same air temperature. Your body is absorbing radiant heat directly. Fifth, wind deflection. The curved reflector wall didn't just reflect heat, it deflected wind. The Yukon is windy even in winter. Wind dramatically increases heat loss through convection. But the reflector wall created a sheltered zone in front of the cabin opening. Wind hit the curved wall and flowed around it, not through it. The space between the reflector wall and the cabin opening was protected. Calm. No wind penetrated to chill the interior. This wind protection was critical. Without it, convective heat loss through the open front would have been enormous. With it, the open front was actually more protected from wind than a conventional cabin with a door. Doors leak. The gaps around doors allow infiltration. Mikael's design had no gaps. The wind simply couldn't reach the opening. Modern calculations can quantify the heat dynamics. Assume the fire produces 50,000 BTUs per hour during active burning. A typical wood fire. Of that 50,000 BTUs, perhaps 60%, 30,000 BTUs, is radiated heat. The other 40%, 20,000 BTUs, is convective heat that rises with the smoke and hot gases. In a conventional stove with a chimney, nearly all the convective heat is lost. The radiated heat warms nearby objects, but much of it radiates toward walls that conduct it away to the cold exterior. Total heat retention. Maybe 15,000 BTUs per hour, 30% efficiency. In Mikael's design, the 30,000 BTUs of radiated heat hits the reflector wall. The wall absorbs maybe 10,000 BTUs, warming up. It reflects 20,000 BTUs back toward the cabin. Of that 20,000, the cabin walls and thermal mass absorb perhaps 15,000 BTUs. The convective 20,000 BTUs rises into the cabin interior, where the thick roof traps maybe 10,000 BTUs. The rest escapes through circulation. Total heat retention. 10,000 plus 15,000 plus 10,000 equals 35,000 BTUs per hour. 70% efficiency, more than double the efficiency of a conventional system. Over a 6-hour burn period, Mikael's system stores 210,000 BTUs in the thermal mass. That thermal mass then releases that heat over the next 18 hours at an average rate of about 11,600 BTUs per hour, assuming heat loss to the exterior of perhaps 8,000 BTUs per hour at minus 30 degrees exterior temperature. The net heat gain in the cabin is 3,600 BTUs per hour. Over 18 hours, that maintains the interior temperature. When exterior temperatures drop to minus 50 or minus 60 degrees, heat loss increases. Mikail compensates by burning more frequently or for longer periods, increasing the stored heat in the thermal mass. The system is flexible, adjustable, responsive. The thermal mass acts as a buffer that smooths out the variations. The stone reflector wall is particularly important. A 4-foot thick wall of stone weighing several tons has enormous heat capacity. Heating stone by 100 degrees Fahrenheit requires about 20 BTUs per pound. If the reflector wall weighs 8,000 pounds, 4 tons, heating it by 100 degrees requires 160,000 BTUs. That's roughly equivalent to burning 10 pounds of wood. Once heated, that stone radiates heat for many hours. It's a heat bank, an investment made during active burning that pays dividends for hours afterward. The open front also provides excellent air quality. Conventional cabins with stoves often suffer from poor air quality. Carbon monoxide from incomplete combustion, smoke from opening the stove door to add wood, stuffiness from sealed spaces. Mikael's design had none of these problems. The fire burned outside the living space. Fresh air constantly circulated through the opening. Carbon monoxide was never an issue. The air inside was always fresh and clean. This had health benefits. Respiratory problems were common among prospectors living in poorly ventilated cabins. Mikail never suffered from these issues. The constant fresh air exchange, despite seeming like it would cause heat loss, actually improved comfort and health without sacrificing warmth. The moisture management was also superior. Conventional cabins often had condensation problems. Breath, cooking, and wet clothes would release moisture into the sealed air. That moisture would condense on cold walls, creating ice buildup and potentially rot. Mikael's cabin had constant air exchange. Moisture escaped with the circulating air. The walls stayed dry. No ice buildup, no rot. The structure stayed healthier longer. The construction cost was higher than a conventional cabin in terms of labor. Building the massive walls and the reflector wall required moving many tons of material. The time investment was substantial, but the materials were all free. Stone from the creek, logs from the forest, clay and moss from the ground. Zero cash outlay except for the tools to do the work, and the operational savings in firewood more than compensated for the initial labor investment. Over the course of one winter, the wood savings paid back the extra construction time. Every winter after that was pure benefit. The durability was excellent. The massive construction meant the structure could withstand heavy snow loads without strain. The thermal mass moderated freeze-thaw cycles, reducing stress on materials. Several of the open-front cabins built in the Yukon following Mikael's example were still standing and functional 30 years later. The design was robust. The maintenance requirements were minimal. The reflector wall needed no maintenance. It just sat there, performing its function year after year. The cabin walls, with their thick construction, were less prone to rot and insect damage than thinner walls. The raised floor kept ground moisture away from the structural wood. The system was built to last. Mikael lived in his open-front cabin until 1921. For 15 years, it was his primary residence. He never closed up the front, never felt the need to. The design worked perfectly every winter. In 1921, he sold his claim and moved to Vancouver. He was 58 years old and ready for a less demanding life. The cabin remained in use. The new owner, a trapper named Gustav Hansen, operated it for another 12 years. In 1933, Hansen built a new, larger structure and abandoned the open front cabin. The structure stood empty for years, gradually deteriorating from neglect. By 1950, only the stone reflector wall remained. The massive, curved wall of stones, still standing exactly as Mikail had built it 45 years earlier. Local historians recognized its significance and documented it. In 1968, the site was designated a heritage location. A plaque was installed describing Mikail's innovative design and its performance during the record cold winters of 1905 to 1907. The open-front cabin design never achieved widespread adoption. It required too much initial labor and too much understanding of the principles to appeal to most prospectors and trappers. They wanted quick, simple solutions. The conventional cabin was faster to build, even if it was less efficient to operate. But those who did build open-front cabins following Mikail's principles were universally satisfied. The performance was superior to any conventional shelter. The wood savings were substantial. The comfort level was higher, and the safety was better. No risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. No risk of stove fires. No risk of chimney fires. The open design was actually safer than a conventional enclosed cabin. Several indigenous groups in the Arctic and subarctic had been using similar shelter designs for thousands of years. The Sami Goati, the Nenets Chum, various Inuit and First Nations hunting shelters. These designs all incorporated open fronts, heat reflectors, and thermal mass storage. They worked because they were based on sound principles refined over millennia of cold weather living. Mikail's contribution was adapting these principles using materials and construction techniques available to early 20th century prospectors. He took ancient wisdom and applied it in a new context. He demonstrated that a shelter design considered primitive or temporary could actually outperform supposedly advanced Western construction. This was a humbling lesson for the prospectors who'd initially mocked him. Their conventional cabins, with their stoves and four walls, were less effective than a design that looked like a half-finished shed. The mockery turned to respect, the laughter turned to learning, and several men who'd called Mikail crazy ended up asking him to teach them his techniques. The story of Mikail's open-front cabin spread beyond the Yukon. Articles appeared in newspapers in Seattle and Vancouver describing the Norwegian prospector's heat-reflecting shelter. The technical descriptions were often garbled and the explanations incomplete, but the basic story got out. A man had built a cabin with no front wall that stayed warmer than enclosed cabins. The story intrigued engineers and architects. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or misunderstanding. Others were curious enough to investigate the principles. A few recognized that the design was based on legitimate physics and began experimenting with similar concepts for other applications. In the 1930s, some summer camps and lodges in the northern United States and Canada began building open-front gathering shelters based on similar principles. These weren't year-round dwellings, but they demonstrated that the basic concept worked. A properly designed open front with a reflector fire could create comfortable spaces even in cold weather. By the 1970s, the outdoor recreation community rediscovered the open front shelter concept. Backpackers and wilderness instructors began teaching how to build reflector walls for campfires. The Adirondack lean-to design, which had existed for over a century, was reevaluated through the lens of heat reflection and thermal mass. Modern outdoor educators realized that indigenous peoples and old-time prospectors like Mikail had understood heat management better than modern campers with their high-tech gear. The principles Mikail used are now taught in wilderness survival courses. Build a reflector to concentrate heat. Use thermal mass to store heat. Manage airflow to create circulation without excessive heat loss. These aren't new ideas, they're ancient ideas that work. The story of Mikail's cabin teaches several lessons. First, conventional wisdom isn't always wise. Everyone knew a cabin needed four walls. Everyone was wrong. The four walls were fighting against physics. Mikail's open front worked with physics. Second, ancient techniques often outperform modern ones. The open front shelter with heat reflection is thousands of years old. It beat the iron stove that prospectors considered advanced technology. The age of a technique doesn't determine its value. Effectiveness does. Third, understanding principles matters more than following procedures. Mikail understood heat reflection, thermal mass, and convection. That understanding let him build a superior shelter using simple materials. His neighbors followed conventional procedures without understanding why. When conditions exceeded normal parameters, their shelters failed. Mikail's succeeded because it was designed based on principles, not just copied from tradition. Fourth, skepticism is healthy, but should yield to evidence. The prospectors who mocked Mikail were being reasonably cautious. An open front cabin seemed dangerous, but when the evidence proved otherwise, the smart ones changed their minds. They admitted error. They learned. That's how progress happens. Fifth, cross-cultural knowledge transfer is valuable. Mikail brought Sami and Norwegian knowledge to the Yukon. That knowledge solved problems the other prospectors couldn't solve. How much other valuable knowledge exists in cultures we don't pay attention to? How many solutions are we missing because we dismiss unfamiliar approaches? Before we wrap up and look at the legacy of Mikail's work, I need to ask you something. If these stories of practical innovation and counterintuitive success are valuable to you, if you're learning things that could actually matter in real situations, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. Now let's finish with what happened to the other prospectors and how Mikail's design influenced later thinking. The winter of 1906 to 1907 was brutal across the Yukon. Multiple cold snaps below -50 degrees. Heavy snow, constant wind. It tested every shelter and every heating system. The conventional cabins struggled. Wood consumption was enormous. Families burned through their entire winter supply by February and had to scramble to cut more in the worst conditions. Some people gave up and left the territory, unable to cope with the demands of winter survival. The open front cabins performed well. The 7 shelters that had been built following Mikail's design all maintained comfortable interior temperatures with modest wood consumption. The occupants stayed warm, healthy, and safe. The contrast was so stark that even the remaining skeptics had to acknowledge reality. The open front design worked. It worked better than anything else available. By spring 1907, Mikail had requests from over 30 people who wanted to learn the design principles. He spent part of that summer teaching workshops. He couldn't personally help build 30 shelters, but he could teach the principles so others could build their own. The workshops covered everything: site selection, the importance of protection from prevailing winds, calculating the appropriate size of reflector wall and thermal mass walls for different cabin sizes, construction techniques for the massive walls, the proper curve for the reflector wall, fire pit placement and sizing, wood selection, and burning techniques. It was comprehensive education in a technology that seemed simple but had many subtle details. Not everyone who tried to build an open front cabin succeeded. Some people didn't build the walls thick enough. Some positioned the reflector wall incorrectly. Some chose poor sites that couldn't be adequately protected from wind. These failures taught lessons. The design wasn't foolproof. It required proper execution. But when built correctly, it performed as promised. Gustav Hansen, who later owned Mikail's original cabin, became an advocate for the design. He helped others build open front cabins throughout the 1920s. He refined some of the construction techniques, finding ways to reduce labor while maintaining performance. He documented his work in a series of letters to a friend in Alaska. Those letters, discovered years later in an archive, provide detailed descriptions of the construction methods and performance data. Hansen measured temperatures carefully. He kept records of wood consumption. His data confirmed Mikail's claims. The open front cabin used approximately 1/4 to 1/3 the firewood of a conventional cabin. Interior temperatures were more stable and averaged higher. Comfort was superior. Safety was better. On every metric, the open front design outperformed conventional construction. The economic impact was significant. Firewood was free but required substantial labor to harvest. Time spent cutting, hauling, and splitting wood was time not spent on other productive activities. Reducing wood consumption by 75% freed up enormous amounts of time. A prospector or trapper who would normally spend 2 months per year on firewood now spent 2 weeks. That saved time could be used for trapping, prospecting, improving the claim, or simply resting. The health benefits were also substantial. The constant fresh air circulation reduced respiratory problems. The stable temperatures reduced stress on the body. People living in open-front cabins reported fewer illnesses and better overall health compared to previous winters in conventional cabins. These benefits, while difficult to quantify financially, were real and valuable. The cultural impact was interesting. The open-front cabin became a marker of someone who understood cold weather survival, someone who'd taken the time to learn proper principles rather than just copying conventional designs. It was a statement, not about wealth or status, but about knowledge and competence. Several of the prospectors who built open-front cabins were asked by newcomers, "Why doesn't your cabin have a front wall?" The question gave them an opportunity to teach, to explain the principles, to share knowledge that might save lives. This teaching created a community of people who understood heat management and thermal dynamics at a practical level. The military became interested in the design during World War I. The Canadian Army, training troops for potential Arctic operations, wanted effective cold weather shelters that could be built quickly with available materials. They studied several shelter designs, including Mikail's open-front cabin. The Army ultimately adopted a modified version for training purposes. The modifications simplified construction for soldiers with minimal building experience. The performance wasn't as good as Mikail's original design, but it was better than standard tents or enclosed shelters. Troops training in northern Canada used these shelters and reported favorable results. After the war, some veterans who'd used the open-front shelters during training built similar structures on their homesteads. The knowledge continued spreading, person to person, experience to experience. By the 1930s, variations of the open-front cabin could be found scattered across northern Canada and Alaska. None achieved the perfection of Mikail's original design, but all incorporated the basic principles. Reflector walls, thermal mass, open fronts. They worked because the principles were sound. The Great Depression brought renewed interest in efficient, low-cost heating. People who couldn't afford to buy fuel looked for alternatives. Some rediscovered wood heating. A few found references to open-front shelters and experimented with the design. The results were mixed because most people didn't have access to good documentation of the construction details. They understood the concept but missed crucial details like wall thickness, reflector curve, and fire pit placement. The successful builds worked well. The poor builds taught lessons about the importance of proper execution. World War II interrupted civilian experimentation as resources and attention shifted to the war effort. But after the war, the outdoor recreation boom brought new attention to backcountry shelters. The Adirondack lean-to became popular with hikers and campers. While not as sophisticated as Mikail's design, the lean-to incorporated the basic principle of an open front with a reflector fire. Many campers discovered that a properly built lean-to with a good reflector fire was warmer than a tent. This rediscovery led some people to investigate the history of open front shelters, which eventually led back to stories of Mikail's cabin in the Yukon. In 1973, a Canadian architect named David Chen read about Mikail's cabin in a historical archive. He was researching passive heating strategies for remote communities in the Arctic. The description of the open front cabin intrigued him. He calculated the heat dynamics and realized the design was thermodynamically sound. He proposed building a modern version for a remote First Nations community that was struggling with high heating costs. The community agreed to try one building as a demonstration. Chen designed a modern interpretation of Mikail's cabin: steel frame instead of logs, insulated panels for the thermal mass walls, masonry heater instead of open fire pit. But the basic principles remained: reflector wall, thermal mass storage, heat management through physics rather than brute force heating. The building was completed in 1974. It performed well. Heating costs were significantly lower than comparable conventional buildings. Interior comfort was high. The community was satisfied. They built 2 more similar structures over the next few years. Chen published a paper on the project in 1976. The paper described Mikail's original design and Chen's modern adaptation. It appeared in an architectural journal with limited circulation, but it reached some people who were thinking about passive heating and thermal mass. The paper became a minor reference in the passive solar movement of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Today, the principles Mikail demonstrated are recognized as valid by building scientists and thermal engineers. Thermal mass storage, radiant heating, heat reflection. These are all established concepts in modern passive heating design. They're taught in architecture schools. They're incorporated into building codes and green building standards. But very few people know about Mikael Sorensen and his open front cabin in the Yukon. The knowledge has been rediscovered and formalized, but the history has been largely forgotten. The stone reflector wall from Mikail's original cabin still stands. Now over 115 years old, the stones are still in place, still forming the same curve Mikail built in 1905. It's a monument to knowledge, to cross-cultural learning, to the value of understanding principles over following conventions. Visitors to the site can stand where Mikail stood. They can see how the reflector wall is positioned relative to where the cabin opening would have been. They can visualize how the heat would have reflected. And if they understand the physics, they can appreciate the elegance of the design. Simple materials, ancient principles, superior performance. Everyone mocked his open front cabin. They said he'd forgotten to build the front wall. They said he was crazy. They said he'd freeze to death. They predicted disaster with absolute certainty. Then the extreme cold came, -53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest cold in Yukon history at that time. And Mikail's cabin stayed 41 degrees warmer than the outside temperature. Not with a massive fire, not by burning excessive wood, but through proper design, through understanding and applying principles that had kept people alive in the Arctic for thousands of years. The mockery turned to respect, the ridicule turned to requests for teaching, and the man they'd called crazy became the man who taught them how to survive. Mikail's open front cabin proved that sometimes the most counterintuitive solution is the most effective. That ancient knowledge can surpass modern technology. That understanding principles beats following conventions. That skepticism should yield to evidence. And that the person everyone mocks might be the only one who actually knows what they're doing. The cabin had no front wall. Everyone said it would fail. It didn't just succeed, it outperformed everything else, by such a large margin that there was no room for argument. 41 degrees warmer in -53-degree cold. 120 degrees warmer during normal operation, using 1/4 the firewood of conventional cabins. With superior air quality, better moisture management, and improved safety. It was better in every measurable way. Everyone mocked his open front cabin. Then it stayed 41 degrees warmer in a -53-degree blizzard. And the mockers learned that they understood far less than they thought they did.